Okay, what is driving Australia and Japan's closer security relations? What are the challenges? And can closer security relations help keep the region peaceful and prosperous in these uncertain times? These are the themes that our panel will be addressing tonight. So good evening, everyone. My name is Michael Hazel. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all here this evening, and also our distinguished panel of experts here to answer your questions tonight. Starting from my right, we have Professor Andrew O'Neill, who is Head of School of Government and International Relations at Griffith University. Andrew is a well-known expert and commentator on Northeast Asian security and has written extensively on North Korea's nuclear program and disarmament. Then we have Professor Rikki Kersten, who is Dean of the School of Arts at Murdoch University in Western Australia. Rikki specialises in Japanese political history, security policy and foreign policy. Rikki has a particular interest in Australia-Japan security relations and the US-Japan alliance. And Ambassador Toshiro Iijima is the Head of Policy Planning and International Security Policy in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Japan. His expertise in international politics is supported by his broad experience, both with his role as Deputy Director General of the Japan Institute of International Affairs and also in various senior posts in the ministry itself. To my left, we have Ms. Mami Mizutori, who is the Executive Director of the Sainsbury Institute for the Study of Japanese Arts and Culture. Prior to joining the Institute for 27 years, Mami worked for the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs in a number of senior positions, including National Security Policy Division and Director of the United Nations Policy Division. And finally, certainly last but not least by any means, is Murray McLean. Murray retired from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in 2012 as one of the most senior members of the Australian Foreign Service with 42 years of work experience, both in Canberra and overseas, with a particular focus on Asia. His final overseas post was as Australia's ambassador to Japan from November 2004 to August 2011. I also would like to acknowledge in our audience this evening Mr. Hidehiro Hosaka, who is the Consul General of Japan, and also Chris Saines, Director of GOMA. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today and pay respect to the elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Finally, I would also like to thank the Japan Ministry of Foreign Affairs for their wonderful support with this event, and in particular, Ambassador Iijima. I would also like to acknowledge the great support we have received from the Brisbane Consulate General staff and the wonderful support they provide us with all of our events. Just a quick reminder, tonight's event is being recorded, and also there is a reception on the terrace after the panel discussion. So you're welcome and indeed invited to come out and continue the discussion, ask questions and have a couple of drinks. So before we get started, I'll just quickly outline how the discussion is going to run tonight. We have a number of questions already submitted by some audience members, which we'll call on, but I also encourage people to get involved, the people here tonight, and ask additional questions. Just raise your hand and we will get to as many of you as possible with a microphone. But please keep your questions short and on topic. So before we begin with our first question for this evening, I'll ask some of our panel members to say a little about the shared interests and other factors that have helped build the close bilateral relationship between Australia and Japan. So Murray McLean, how would you explain the strength and success of the relationship?
Thank you, Michael. I'd like to just say a few words on this. First of all, I think the modern Australia-Japan relationship is something of a model for all of our bilateral relationships with other countries in Asia. And I say that because it's of its depth and its warmth and its comprehensiveness. After the war, which obviously was a very bitter experience for Australia, it was quite remarkable that within 10 years Australia was negotiating an agreement on commerce with Japan, the second country, only second after the United States to do so. And I think that characterises the relationship generally. That is, I think, a very special point about the relationship, namely that it's a model of how to go about reconciliation, a reconciliation from having been sworn and bitter enemies to growing friends, and now, of course, with a warmth and depth of relationship that is truly remarkable. The economic relationship which the Agreement on Commerce got going formally, of course, is the ballast of the relationship, and certainly was for the first 40 years of that period since 1957. During the time from the mid-60s through to the global financial crisis of 2007, Japan was Australia's -- trading partner. Of course, things changed then, and China is by far the largest now. But the fact is that Japan is still #2. We still have huge investment from Japan into Australia, something like 3 times the amount of investment that China has in Australia still. And I think the other last point I wanted to make particularly is that the relationship is characterised by a special degree of closeness at the grassroots level, if I can put it that way. There are many Australia-Japan societies on both sides, in both countries. There are very, very close business ties, not only between companies, but at the institutional level. The high level of the participation in the annual Australia-Japan Business Conference is not matched by any other bilateral chambers of commerce. And in addition, there's the very close connection between the children of our 2 countries, with something like 60 or 70,000 Chinese children coming here every year on school exchanges, and a sizable number going back there from Australia. And Japanese is still an extremely popular language in schools. So all of that, I think, goes to providing the strength that we see in the relationship today. And it's only since then, since about 10 years ago, that we've really moved into the security cooperation, and that's what we're talking about today.
Just on that point there, Murray, I might ask Rikki Kersten to tell us a little bit about the way in which the relationship has expanded from the kinds of traditional sources that Murray has outlined into this new era of closer security cooperation. Could you say a little about what's driving that?
Oh, I could spend hours doing that. I think it's really remarkable that it's happening. I was saying to some of the panellists earlier today that I never thought, when I started studying Japanese, and I was sitting in a class with 4 other people at the time at Adelaide University, that one day I would be talking to people about a relationship that I believe is moving towards one of possibly a full alliance status. It is a increasingly close and real-world focused relationship when it comes to security, and it's security that's rounded out the relationship. So Murray has taken us over the terrain. You know, it has been a story of consolidation. You start with overcoming conflict. It moves through trade and complementarity and mutual interest. Yeah. And it moves into people-to-people relations. Then you have a close political relationship. And it is now becoming one where security is becoming not only heavily institutionalised in the relationship, with numerous bilateral agreements supported by a shared alliance relationship with the US, backed up by the trilateral strategic dialogue mechanism. You not only have things like that, but we are now in a situation of being the first country with whom Japan would ever embark on serious defence manufacture and export, including sharing information and technology. So that's an incredible story, And it could only be happening now if there was that deeply entrenched trust and mutual recognition of shared interests and values. And this is rhetoric, but if it wasn't there, we wouldn't be where we are today.
Exactly. Well, actually, Rikki, that's a very good segue into our first question this evening, when you mentioned the increasing trust in the relationship and the extent to which security cooperation is now seeing exchange of high-tech material, classified material that Japan does not share, basically, with any other country. So our first questioner, unfortunately, hasn't made it tonight, but I'll ask his question for him. It comes from Brian Walker, and his question is, in terms of alliance cooperation and closer ties between Australia and Japan, how much weight do you give to the future submarine project? The submarine project is, of course, the big elephant in the room at the moment. Can this type of complex military procurement ensure ongoing cooperation between our two countries? And for our first response, I'll turn to Ambassador Iijima.
Thank you very much, Professor Hizu, for giving me the floor. I think we put much importance on this big project. So there are many reasons for that. So Japan and Australia are Pacific countries, so both countries are responsible for the stability of the region. And Japan and Australia are allies of the United States, respectively. So in that sense, the cooperation, security cooperation among Japan, Australia, and US is crucially important for the security policy in this region. And number three, Japan and Australia have bilaterally strategic partnership, and based upon that, so most recently we confirmed our relationship as special relationship. So, but this is not limited to the security cooperation, but so we have the economic cooperation. That is, so Japan and Australia have agreed the EPA, Economic Partnership Agreement, and most recently, both countries are originating member countries of the TPP, which gives us the more horizon for expanding trade and investment in the Pacific region. So I think on top of that, we are now talking about the submarine project. I think in that sense, I would say the submarine project is not limited to constructing submarines, but also perhaps it will give us the new horizon to expand our economic cooperation into the industrial cooperation as a whole. I think we have the huge potential for expanding our cooperation, not only in security area, but also in economic cooperation area. So I think in that sense, this submarine project is crucially important for us.
Okay, thank you very much. Andrew, would you like to add anything on that?
Thanks, Michael. Look, I just endorse everything the Ambassador said about the importance of the submarine project. I was in Tokyo last year, partly as a guest of the Japanese Foreign Ministry, and what became clear in discussions is that many Japanese interlocutors really see the sub-deal as emblematic of a new era in the bilateral relationship, which I think is a great thing. And this is a real opportunity to reinforce the relationship. It's quite remarkable in a sense that the first visit by an Australian Defence Minister to Japan didn't actually happen, a serving Australian Defence Minister didn't happen until 1994. So in a sense, this side of the relationship is pretty recent. It's pretty recent. And so I think from the Japanese perspective, this is a very important deal, both in terms of the conversation in Japan moving forward with respect to the export of military-related equipment, but it's also very important in terms of what it says about the maturity of the bilateral relationship. For Australia, I think it would be a significant step. And I think, how do we know that? I think we know that by what some observers in the region are saying about the importance of this. And we've seen just over the last week, the Chinese Foreign Ministry issue a statement that Australia should think very carefully about what it negotiates with Japan, what its decision when it comes to the submarine. So I think this is going to be, I think it's going to be a significant step forward, not just in terms of a transaction of high-tech military equipment, but actually I think what we might see if the sub deal between Australia and Japan is approved, what we will see actually is a new era in the strategic relationship. And the question for me there is, I think the Japanese are ready for it. I'm not entirely convinced Australia is ready for it yet.
Yeah, that's a good point, Andrew. I mean, the fact that the Japanese government has very recently said that it's very, very willing to share top secret technology with Australia, that it shares with no other country, including the United States, is an indication, I think, of the enthusiasm in Tokyo to develop the relationship more closely. But there is that ambivalence in Australia still, perhaps.
But I
Rikki?
think, yeah, there's another reason why it's Australia, though, Andrew. I think because it's Australia and not the US, the fear of entrapment that usually accompanies any movement in the security or alliance side of business, the defence side, it's absent. It's more of an affirmation of the new security direction in Japan and less about, if we go into this, what are the risks, where are we going to end up being exposed. The removal of the fear of entrapment in partnering with Australia as opposed to the US, I think is a really significant factor.
Yeah, okay. Mami, did you have anything you'd like to say on that fear of entrapment that Rikki mentioned, or any other aspect of the submarine?
I would think about two things. Probably this story is not such a big story in Japan yet as it is here. And coming here, I felt it was really interesting because I've already seen lots of articles on, if not the first front page, the second or third page about this, so you can see the attention that it's getting. The other thing is that just over 10 years ago, when I was still a civil servant at the Foreign Ministry, one of my in my portfolio was this thing about the ban, a total ban on export of weapons from Japan to basically any country. There was a bit of exception with the United States, but not anything else to any other country. And within 14 years or so, now we're talking about this big defense cooperation, which I think really it talks about how Japan has matured. It's not only about the bilateral relationship between Australia and Japan, but how Japan has matured in this field and how people are confident about it. So I think it's a really good development, and I sincerely hope that we get the deal.
Yes, Murray McLean, you.
Just like to make a couple of comments on this matter. I think one of the key comments that I'd like to make on what Mami has just said is that when I was ambassador in Tokyo, we were doing all the pushing to put Japan across the line of even a memorandum of understanding on security cooperation, and that was only 10 years ago. In fact, 9 or 10 years ago. And it's remarkable really how speedy things have been since then. And we should, and it is right, I think, what Andrew's saying, that I'm not sure if Australia's quite ready to take a full security relationship with Japan as it would seem Japan is. But the glue that holds Australia and Japan together in this strategic space is the United States, and the fact that Australia and the United States and Japan and the United States respectively are allies. And we also have a trilateral strategic dialogue amongst the three countries as well, quite apart from what else the United States itself does independently by way of projecting its, or, moving its focus more to Asia. So it's all of those factors are lining up, I think.
Yes, okay, no, that's a very good point. Well, the issue of the alliance with the United States is certainly going to come up again during our discussion, particularly in the next session when we're looking at, or the next theme when we're looking at the challenges that closer security relations may pose. But let's just change tact a little bit away from the military aspect of closer cooperation and look more at the people-to-people side. We have a question from one of our audience members, Courtney Organ, if she's here at the moment. Courtney, would you like to share your question with us?
Thank you. So my question, I spent last year in Japan under a new Colombo Plan scholarship, so it sort of...
I'm sorry, could you just speak up a little bit?
It stems from my experience in Japan last year under a new Colombo Plan scholarship. So my question is, with the tightening bilateral relations, will this mean greater opportunities for Australians to work professionally and more permanently in Japan? And if yes, what industries do you think will be the most significant in the coming years?
Okay, Mami Mizutori, this is a good question, particularly since it comes on the heels of recent announcements in the bilateral relationship where we're seeing, for example, steps taken for recognition of Australian university degrees in Japan, greater academic exchange between the two countries. Would you like to comment?
Yeah. I think there are some key words in Courtney's question, which I think is in a more permanent way, because yes, we do welcome young Australians, young people to come to Japan to stay for several months or half a year, and we're very happy with that. But indeed, it is true that when it comes to a more permanent job or even immigrating, let's say, there are still lot of, if I will, barriers. And it's not only about Japan, Australia, but with many other countries. But I do feel that there are openings there. As you may know, the Japanese universities are very keen to internationalize. And then also, of course, tourism is a big area where we are in need of more and more English-speaking people who can contribute to the development of that industry. And I think still there's, if you ask a Japanese, are you for or against immigration, there might be mixed answers. But if you think about Australian people, we have common values, and I think it's a country from which generally people would like to welcome workers to come, not only for a short time of period. So my sincere hope is that it will be the case, and I would cite academia and tourism.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Rikki, Kersten and I were speaking earlier about how despite the fact there have been certain downturns, well not downturns, but scaling down of the size of the economic relationship between Australia and Japan, that other aspects of it have continued to grow. And one of those aspects, of course, has been Japanese language study in Australia. And Queensland, for example, still has very large numbers. Japanese language is the most popular foreign language studied in Queensland. And I think overall, Australia ranks very highly internationally in terms of the number of Japanese speakers. So does that kind of background that's been built up largely on the types of issues that Murray first mentioned beginning in terms of the people-to-people exchange and the closeness that was developed in those realms, do you think that places Australia in something of a unique position in terms of developing closer people-to-people professional-type relations with Japan?
Oh, there's no question. Australians feel incredibly comfortable in Japan, and it's a mutual thing. I think the Australian government's, Courtney, the Australian government's got a lot of ambition in the services sector in the wake of the Economic Partnership Agreement, and that would extend from tourism into aged care. In particular, I think there are opportunities for bilingual Australians in Japan, but increasingly the way Japan is looking to its own region to attract students to its universities from Southeast Asia, China, Korea, India. Australians who go to Japan will, I think, increasingly see Japan as a hub within its region and not just a country on its own. I think a lot of students studying at university these days are starting to realise they can't be one country specialists, that it's better to have a broader transnational perspective of the place of the language that interests you. So developing that perspective, Japan in its region, Japan in the world, Japan as a transnational actor, is going to stand you in good stead in any number of industries.
Okay, Andrew.
I'll just add to that. I mean, I think a lot of, and Murray touched on this at the beginning, a lot of people do overlook the comprehension and the depth of the bilateral foreign direct investment relationship between Australia and Japan. I mean, Japan is number 3 after the US and the UK as investing the most in Australia, which I think is quite significant. And Murray said, we're still streets ahead of China effectively. And there are many Australian SMEs investing in Japan still, post-Fukushima. The investment environment, I think, is still pretty robust. Many large corporates. So, there are significant opportunities there, I think, for graduates, certainly with in-country experience through the NCP, through the New Colombo Plan, but through just generally travelling through Japan, learning the language. And I do think there is widespread demand there for savvy graduates with a lot of in-country experience in the corporate sector.
And in the skiing sector too, it seems.
Corporate skiing sector.
The corporate skiing sector, indeed.
Just one additional point to all of that. There have been, of course, some major recent new investments by Japan in Australia, one of which, of course, is Japan Post's buyout of Toll Holdings. And so that's a very important sector, and Japan Post bought that because of the connections and the links that Toll has in the rest of Southeast Asia. So, there are opportunities there. But the other one that I think is quite exciting is Uniqlo. Uniqlo is expanding significantly in Australia, and there are now 3 in Melbourne, 2 in Sydney, and I think at least one, if not more than one, coming up here in Brisbane, and potentially in Perth as well. Now, though Uniqlo is, I was speaking to some people only the other night about this matter, and they are on the lookout for bright young graduates from Australian universities, not just people who have got their HSC or whatever it's called here, but people who have commerce degrees and that sort of subject to work in a Japanese exciting retail enterprise.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Murray. Okay, we might move on to our next theme, the challenges that closer security relations may create for the bilateral relationship. And to kick off in this theme, I'll ask David Shack to ask his question.
Well, the elephant or the whale in the Asia Pacific is China. Any move that anybody makes in the Pacific is interpreted in China as an effort to contain it, although it's been China itself that has been the one that has been trying to change the status quo and push the boundaries. So my question is, should Australia and Japan limit their security cooperation in order to accommodate Chinese concerns?
Okay, thank you very much, David. I'll begin with Andrew. I know that Andrew loves to talk about this.
The answer to your question is no, but look, I think the Japanese have made it very clear how they regard the rise of China, and we were talking before about the glue that holds Australia and Japan together in terms of bilateral strategic cooperation, irrespective of the US, right, is in large part what China is perceived to be doing in the South China Sea. That is a major driver of the relationship. I think certainly from the Japanese perspective, it's unambiguous. Japan has its foreign policies, has its strategic interests, and while I think it's doubtful you'll see direct armed conflict between Japan and China, I think there are many issues over which the two countries will continue to have tense relationships. I think in Australia, so in a sense, Japan's view is pretty unambiguous. No, China should not impede a strong bilateral strategic relationship between Australia and Japan. And from Tokyo's perspective, it doesn't matter what China does, we should just get on with business and move the bilateral relationship forward. I think Australia's view is more complex than that, and a bit more complicated. I notice that Stephen Conroy from the Labor Party came out today saying that Australia should be much more robust in moving forward with freedom of operations, freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea. I'll be interested to see how many of his Labor colleagues are behind him on that, because I think there are some issues within the Labor Party in terms of framing policy towards Japan. I think we've seen elements of it in the way in which the opposition has approached the submarine deal. What will the Chinese think about this?
Could I just pick up on that point there, Andrew, that you raised? There is a certain ambivalence in Australia towards the relationship with Japan insofar that there are people engaged in the public debate that warn against getting China offside as a result of getting too close to Japan. I was just wondering, on that point, Ambassador Iijima, what are the perceptions in Japan of this ambivalence in Australia towards the relationship because of this fear being expressed by some in the debate about basically getting closer to Japan means getting further from China, essentially? What are Japan's perceptions of that debate in Australia? But also, is there a similar sentiment in Japan?
I think so, yes. In Japan, we share the similar situation. That is, so one side, we should be prepared for the Chinese assertiveness in terms of security policy. But on the other hand, so both Japan, just like Australia, the economic relationship between Japan and China is still crucially important for the Japanese economy. So I think in that sense, so we often hear from the industry side that we should manage the situation so that the Japanese enterprise can conduct business smoothly. So I think we should reconcile the situation. But for the question posed by the floor, I think the most important thing for us, both countries, Japan and Australia, is to make every effort to urge or engage China to go along with us in a more constructive way. So I think this is the most important effort for us both, not to make contentious situation, not to create a contentious situation between the both camps, but we should continue our efforts to engage China more in a more constructive way. Okay. That's my point.
Okay, it's very interesting. Okay, let me turn to Mami Mizutori for a moment. As Executive Director of the Sainsbury Institute in the UK, you're watching these kinds of developments between Australia and Japan and the kind of tensions that have developed over recent years in the East China Sea and the South China Sea from a distance, from outside of the region. Could you tell us a little bit about how people from that side of the world are looking at these kinds of developments?
Michael, that's a very interesting question because I've been living in the UK for the past 6 years, and lots of you may know that UK is becoming very close to China, which is fine because we all have very close relationship with China in terms of economic relations, as Ambassador Iijima just said. But there is, even in the eyes of the UK media, a rather worrying tendency of a relationship that is not only about commerce, but not talking about human rights issues, or not bringing up things that China would get irritated with. I think it's something that's happening in Germany too, in France too. But in a way, it can't be helped maybe because we don't, when I say we, I'm talking about UK, France, Germany, but unlike Australia and Japan, they don't share the same geographical space. So for them, the economic relationship is, of course, the most important, and they don't want the East Asian area to be in turmoil, but for them, security issues are more about the Middle East, more about Russia, Ukraine. So that's how I see it from there, and I think there's a very different way of looking at China here and there.
Yeah, so the balance of threat perceptions are very, very different.
Very different.
Yeah. Yes, Murray McLean.
And that's right. The balance of threat perceptions are quite different, and I also wanted to make that point about Japan and Australia, respectively, in respect of China, because yes, Australia and Japan have a remarkable degree of commonality in our interests, particularly in wanting ongoing peace and security in the Asia-Pacific region. But the fact is that Japan is just across the water from China, so it poses a major presence in Japanese strategic thinking, whereas Australia is way down south. And to boot, we also have a huge economic relationship, just like Japan does. I'm glad that the Ambassador Iijima made that point in respect of Japan as well, because there is amazing integration between the Japanese and Chinese economies, just as there is between the Australian and Chinese economies, as well as the Australian and Japanese economies. So it's much more complex than a zero-sum type of thing. I think that the important point about China, sorry, I'll keep away from this microphone a bit close. The Chinese would no doubt prefer that Australia did not purchase Japanese submarines. And that's because they would see the purchase of Japanese submarines as being the precursor of a strengthened strategic security relationship. That, however, and the Foreign Minister Wang Yi recently said that when Minister Bishop was in Beijing. He also made some not very veiled comments about how he hoped that Australia would think about the history of the Second World War in respect of Japan before linking up with Japan by buying its submarines. Now, he would say that, wouldn't he? But because it's actually would be far better from their point of view if there is not such a link. But the way to deal with China is not to say, oh, well, we better appease them and not do anything, but to consider one's own interests, that is, one's country's interests, and determine on the balance whether it is a good idea to go with Japan for the submarines, and that it may involve strategic interests. It may also involve, and certainly should involve, the technological advantages of a submarine project. But it shouldn't be dictated by what the Chinese think or say. And that's really the point, because as soon as you do that, then the Chinese know that they've got you, as it were.
Well, just to pick up on that point a little more and go back to, I think, something Rikki was mentioning before in terms of the closer security relations becoming more and more alliance-like, or at least quasi-alliance-like. I mean, obviously from China's perspective, they see this kind of closer security relationship, this cross-bracing in the alliances with the United States, the building of the quasi-alliance status. But from Australia and Japan's perspectives, are there many other reasons for this security cooperation to be occurring other than basically the so-called China choice or the China threat, for example? It's not all about China?
It's not all about China. We have a country not too far away from China and Japan, North Korea, that poses a distinct threat in terms of nuclear capability and ballistic missile technology, the ability to deliver a weapon, or just the threat of implosion and the destabilising effect that would have on the entire region. There is that. But there are other questions as well. I think David talked about containment as being one of China's responses. But a reply to that is it's not containment, it's deterrence. And the quality of the US alliance in general, the rebalance strategy, which is premised very much on enhancing the capability of US allies independently, as independent actors who are part of the hub and spokes US alliance system. So Japan and Australia, being allies with the US, having a strengthened bilateral security relationship between them, meets the expectations of the rebalance strategy. It does dramatically increase the demonstration effect or the believability of the effectiveness of the alliance system, even through this indirect bilateral relationship between Australia and Japan. And it's also about enhanced interoperability that if anything were to go awry in the region, whether that be China or anything else, that there's more than one player in town, that it's not up to the US and everybody else stands back and waits for the US to come in. It's about other nations in collaboration, in cooperation, having an effective means of responding. And that is not just about China, it's about the environment. It's about major catastrophes, such as the triple emergency in Japan, in Tohoku. So it's also about humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. It's not all military either. So it's about the capability aspect as well. And that's how I would see the added value coming out here.
So, yeah.
Can I just add something?
Certainly, Andrew.
We have an election in the US at the end of the year, just in case anyone hasn't noticed. And we'll have a new administration in Washington. And you can bet your bottom dollar that every single US ally around the world, and we know how carefully Japanese strategists watch what the US is doing with its alliances, both in Asia and in Europe, by the way, will be watching very carefully about the credibility of US security assurances as the new administration goes forward. And I think irrespective of the parallel alliance relationships that Japan and Australia has with the US, Japan and Australia have a lot in common, I think, as some of the panellists have said, and will naturally gravitate towards each other as the strategic environment starts to become much more fluid, I think, with North Korea's rise as a fully fledged nuclear weapon state, as China starts to push harder in the South China Sea, as the US election approaches. So I think what you'll see is a kind of mutual gravitation, if you like, irrespective of the US alliance both countries have.
So, Andrew, irrespective of China and what's happening in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, is there an argument to be made that there are very compelling reasons for the closer security cooperation, the so-called cross-bracing, simply as a way of keeping the United States engaged in the region? There are question marks about the United States' commitment into the future, given its fiscal problems, given its change of administration. So the United States requires greater burden sharing from its allies, its two key allies. And if its key allies aren't providing that burden sharing, is there a risk that the United States will start to slowly disengage from the region, which...
He may do that anyway. I mean, Donald Trump is clear. He thinks allies are basically free riding and should be doing a lot more for themselves. So you could laugh at Donald Trump as US president maybe a month or two ago, whereas now I don't see many people laughing at that prospect. So I think there are actually differences between the candidates when it comes to alliances.
But is that, Murray McLean, is that even more reason for Australia and Japan to be looking at doing more to keep the US interested in through closer security cooperation?
Well, frankly, I'd be astonished if the United States, just because of a change of president, would suddenly pull back from an active engagement in the Asia Pacific. I mean, it's got allies obviously in Australia, it's got allies in Korea, and of course Japan, and those relationships will continue to be sustained. There's no question about that. As far as China's concerned, that's the game really in terms of the grand strategic issues. And I think, I was reading an extremely long press conference that was held yesterday between Kerry and Wang Yi, the Chinese Foreign Minister, which actually I was quite encouraged by, because it went through a lot of issues, but it shows that both sides, I think, do understand the responsibility of working as let's say, great powers. I don't have a pessimistic idea of the world, I have to say. That might change if Donald Trump were to become president, but I don't think he's going to become president. But anyway, that's what I really am saying is that I think the United States will continue to sustain very much a very active and constructive role in support of the peace and security of this region.
Okay, thank you very much. Mami Mizutori, is there anything you would like to add on that in terms of US engagement and perhaps the Japanese perception of...
Well, I think it is vital for the two countries to, if not work together, but both work on the United States to keep them engaged in the region. And of course, it's not only about security. It's important, the TPP too, isn't it? Both Australia and Japan, I think, have the treaty at their Diet Parliament right now, and hopefully they're going to be ratified. But if the United States doesn't ratify it, then it's the end of it. So we do have a very strong mission collectively to keep US engaged, and if that means burden sharing, I think we're prepared to do some of it, but it's not only about that. I think it's also about convincing the United States constantly about the need for them to be engaged in the region.
That's a very good point. Okay, we might move on to our final theme, the ways in which stronger security ties might be achieved while also maintaining an inclusive regional environment. And at this point, I'd just like to encourage the members of the audience here tonight to get involved. If you have some questions with the comments and topics that are being raised by our panel tonight, please raise your hand and we'll get a microphone to you. But we'll start off with a question from Jock Young, if he's here this evening.
In the face of Chinese militarization and North Korea belligerence, what action from the Australian and Japanese government is required to guarantee peaceful stability in the Asian region?
Okay. Ambassador Iijima, would you like to begin with that?
Yes, I think we have 2 points. One is to enhance the deterrence by solidarity or the defense cooperation is crucially important. And another thing is not only bilateral security defense cooperation, but also we do need the support or the solidarity from the other countries like the ASEAN or of course the US, but anyhow, we have the mechanism in the region of the ARF, Asian Regional Forum, or the ADM Plus, or the East Asian Summit, and so on. So I think to use these mechanisms, we should urge the North Korea or the other unstable situation to go along with the situation to keep the stability in the region. I think to prepare to enhance deterrence is of course important, but at the same time, so we should proceed the discussions or the consultation with North Korea. Our door is open.
Okay, yep. Thank you. Rikki, Kersten.
Oh, it's such a fantastic question, Jock. I think there are a number of opportunities that we can see in the region, and they're in what I call the undergoverned spaces in international relations, in particular space and cyberspace. They're under-regulated, they're undergoverned. There is an international shared interest in improving the way that, or imposing any management at all of how these realms operate in the international system. And for Australia and Japan, China, and other nations to collaborate in building a regime, a governance regime for space and cyberspace would be so valuable. Because in the end, when we talk about the things that have been raised so far, it's about the liberal international system. It's about an assumption that playing by the rules is the way that things ought to be done. And we have a country in China who occasionally suggests that these rules, followed in this way, might not necessarily suit everyone, and there may be other ways of doing things. rather than shaping Chinese behaviour to suit the established liberal international system, how great would it be to have China at the table with Japan, with Australia, building the rules together? It sounds naive when I say that, but creating rules rather than enforcing them to me seems highly desirable.
Yes, that's right. Murray McLean, what kind of measures would have to be in place for that to happen?
I think that's a way off yet, to be honest, to have China and Japan and Australia and possibly also the United States involved. It'd have to be the United States as well. I think the Chinese would feel that we were ganging up on them. It would be a 3-to-1 contest. It'd be very difficult, I think, to get a close understanding of points of view. But one of the reasons I said I was quite encouraged by this Kerry Wang Yi press conference was that what they announced was effectively that the two sides have come very close to an agreed form of words for a new United Nations Security Council resolution on North Korea's nuclear program and its ballistic missile program, which is really quite significant. So there can be things that can be achieved. I don't want to belittle Australia and Japan respectively, but the fact is that the Chinese see themselves as not as our equals, but as the United States equals, and they're the people that they'll speak to and do deals with. They'll want to dictate to us.
Yeah, that's right. And of course, there are a number of other potential crises looming in the region, apart from the natural disasters that we unfortunately see from time to time. There's also the question of North Korea. And so we have a question from Brendan Fugate, if he's here tonight, that raises the question of North Korea. Brendan, would you like to address the panel?
Hi there. Recently we've seen North Korea be perhaps a little bit more unstable and erratic than usual. In the event of a North Korean collapse, how would Japan respond and also the region?
So, Mami, would you like to take that question? It's a bit of a curly one, I know, but what do you think Japan's response would be to a collapse in North Korea? So a collapse of the regime, Brendan?
Potentially, or should we be more proactive to encourage that?
To make
To encourage
the collapse.
To encourage the collapse.
I think it really depends how the collapse happens, whether it implodes or whether there's a, hopefully not, but armed conflict. But definitely there will be need for, first and foremost, evacuation of, I think, a lot of Japanese citizens and maybe even South Korean citizens from the peninsula. I believe that there are already careful planning done between the United States and Japan and South Korea in that event. And then secondly, looking at what's happening in Europe right now with all the refugees, there will be a lot of refugees, I imagine, coming from North Korea. So we need to be able to respond to the humanitarian aspect. But after the first wave of occurrences, I imagine that it would be up to really, this issue would be for the United Nations to think, to really decide what to do in terms of actually helping North Korea to normalize as quickly as possible. There is no, as you know, formal diplomatic relation between North Korea and Japan, but if North Korea becomes a normal country, I am sure that Japan would be willing to help its development, and it's so it's kind of difficult to say anything concrete when we don't know what the scenario is. But I just kind of thinking off the top of my head, those kind of sequences would happen probably.
Okay, Andrew O'Neill, you've studied North Korea quite closely for a number of years now. What do you think of the prospects, or what are the kinds of things that would have to happen in order for some kind of normalisation to occur in North Korea?
Time, lots of time. I mean, like a lot of things, what is normalisation in the case of North Korea? I mean, I think getting back to the question, which I think is a really good one, is, you know, how would countries react? I think countries would react in different ways. I mean, the Japanese would be very focused on what the implications would be for Korean unification. I think that's the big issue for Japan too. I think the Chinese obviously would be very focused on the refugee issue. They're very focused on that now in terms of securing a 1,400-kilometre border with the DPRK. The Americans will be very focused on what that means with respect to the strategic presence of US forces in Northeast Asia. But I think what all countries will be focused on, including Japan and Australia, would be how, if at all, could North Korea's weapons of mass destruction be secured with any breakdown of central authority within that country. And I think of all the things that probably keeps policymakers up at night, it's that question. How do you secure that? And you know, the South Koreans may have a scenario about how they will race to Pyongyang to secure those assets. It may be in sync with the US scenario. It probably almost certainly won't be in sync with the Japanese scenario, and probably not at all with China's. So you can sort of see where this is heading, and it kind of really does reinforce the point that there's a good reason why countries have worked very hard for a long time now to make sure the DPRK does not collapse. I mean, that's the number one strategic priority, I think, for a lot of countries in Northeast Asia.
Rikki, Kersten, do you have any thoughts on that point?
Everybody's robbed to the best lines. I think, yeah, well, that's it. So, yeah, securing the nukes is one thing. I think there'd be a concern about containing Chinese influence on the peninsula in the wake of an implosion of that kind. And if we look at the example of Germany, the reunification, the cost, the sheer cost of bringing the North into the 20th and then the 21st century
it's going to be huge.
Should not be underestimated.
That's right.
And I can't even begin to think about the psychological dimensions of that.
Well, Germany struggled with the cost.
They still are. The cultural and psychological dimensions, also the human part of that puzzle, so difficult. I don't think it can be managed at all.
Well, it's clearly an issue that requires a very large amount of participation and involvement from China in terms of dealing with the North Korea dispute. But we've seen in recent times there's a real reluctance for Beijing to put pressure on North Korea. And part of that, no doubt, relates to the question of North Korea being an ally in a region where China doesn't have very many allies, basically. China clearly is concerned about US and its allies getting influence in the peninsula should something happen to North Korea. Getting back to the point, one of the major points of this theme, which is what the Australia-Japan relationship and indeed our relationship together with the United States can do to maintain an inclusive regional environment. How do we go about convincing China that this is an inclusive status quo that doesn't pose any existential threats, that a change of regime in North Korea does not necessarily have to be a major blow to China's security interests? Are there kinds of measures that can be taken? Mari McLean?
Gee, that's a huge question. Look, as far as China's engagement with the region is concerned, there are many, many positive things that you can point to. You know, while there may well be strategic considerations behind a number of their policy positions, such as the formation of the Asian Infrastructure Bank and its so-called Silk Roads and the Sea Silk Road and those sorts of things, they are actually playing a very active role in assisting the economic and development of a number of the less well-developed of our Asian country friends. That's one thing I'd say is quite quite important. I think, you know, when Deng Xiaoping changed policy from the Maoism autarky in 1978 to an outgoing approach of reform and opening up and bringing in international investment, foreign investment and whatnot, part of that was that China wants to have a peaceful and stable Asian environment in order to ensure that it has the opportunity to build up its economic growth. And that, in a sense, is still the case, albeit that over the last 5 or 10 years we've seen the moves that upset the rest of Asia, which are its encroachments backed by dubious claims for sovereignty over the islands of the South China Sea in particular, not to mention also the dispute with Japan over the Senkaku Diaoyutai Islands. So it's a mixed picture is really what I wanted to say. You've got a lot of quite positive developments where China wants to be part of the region, but it does want to influence the region. It doesn't like to deal in multilateral fora where others gang up against it or it sees being ganged up against. For example, in respect of ASEAN, it does have a dialogue process over the issue of sovereignty in the South China Islands, but it doesn't really play that game. It likes to take out one country at a time, which of course it can dominate and put huge pressure on. So it's a complex picture. I don't think we should see it all as negative by any means. On the other hand, we shouldn't, as Australia and Japan, I mean, stand back and allow China simply to take over these islands and place whatever they've put on them, missiles or whatever they're there, without our opinions being pretty clearly thought. And you know, I think the Stephen Conroy comments were actually quite interesting because, you know, maybe it would be a good idea if all the countries of the region just sailed their boats through that 12 kilometre zone because, you know, they are disputed and that and China says it upholds freedom of navigation and so why not just exercise it?
The other issue there is, of course, is that around about 60% of all Australia's trade goes through that region.
Exactly.
So as one commentator in the ongoing debate in Australia in terms of our foreign relations with China, Japan and the United States has said, from an Australian point of view, the bottom line is that it's about taking a stand rather than taking sides.
Yes, yes, exactly.
So,
yeah.
And perhaps that's a very good note for us to end our discussion on this evening, I think. So I'd like everyone to join me in thanking our panellists this evening. And before we retire for drinks and further discussion on the terrace, I would just like to invite Griffith Asia Institute's Dr. Kathleen Turner to come up and give a vote of thanks. Thank you, Kathleen.
Thank you, Michael. Ladies and gentlemen, I think you would all agree with me this evening that this has been a very interesting and stimulating discussion. In particular, I thought it was a useful dissection of the different types of shared regional and bilateral interests that drive closer security relations between the two countries. We had mentioned foreign direct investment, the alliance with the US, as well as the associated challenges. Space and cyberspace was mentioned, as well, of course, North Korea's nuclear program. Ladies and gentlemen, The Griffith Asia Institute is one of Australia's leading Asia research and policy dialogue centres. We regularly hold forums such as this, engaging leading and reputable members from government and industry to bring you forums to discuss issues of regional importance, not the least of which is the bilateral relationship between Australia and Japan. May I reiterate Michael's opening comments on opening thanks to the Consul General and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Japan for their generous support. And of course, may I ask you to again, ladies and gentlemen, to thank our esteemed panellists and moderator for this evening's event, Ambassador Toshiro Iijima, Mr. Murray McLean, Professor Rikki Kersten, Miss Mami Mizutori, Professor Andrew O'Neill, and of course, Associate Professor Michael Hazel. Thank you. This officially ends this evening's proceedings, but may I warmly invite you all for drinks and canapes outside on the terrace. Thank you very much.